Winston Allen, you're welcome to my show.
Wow, great.
We've been setting this up for quite a while, and I'm very excited about having you as my guest because, like a lot of people in business, in academia, and in public life, you have a remarkable story, and we're going to get to that in a moment. I need to do a brief introduction. In the
Now,
early 1960s, you made history by becoming the first black-owned broker-dealer on Wall Street. It
yes,
led to a lot of public attention and some very positive media coverage, which caught the eyes of corporate executives at Xerox, where you went on to have a hugely successful career. You were a real estate developer, a Fulbright scholar, inventor, a professor at George Washington and American University graduate business schools. Wow, that's a distinguished career. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and maybe we could go back to the beginning because you grew up in Harlem uh, to immigrant parents.
yes. I grew up in Harlem in 1930s and 40s, and Harlem was quite unique at that point. It had just started to be a very elegant part of the city of New York and Manhattan, and I was fortunate to live very close to the border of Harlem, which was 110th Street and the top of Central Park. So I was 3 blocks away on 113th Street. And at that point, early life in 30s, we had many artists and musicians and historians, so forth, living in the area. So I got to know a lot of people that were very, very exceptional in many, many respects. So my life was very ideal in Harlem, and I felt very comfortable being there, and I had many, many friends and associates.
Your parents were immigrants. Your dad came from Jamaica and your mum was from Grenada. And I read your biography, and we're going to talk about that later because you published a book recently. Fascinating reading, by the way. Well worth picking it up. Um, they, how would you characterize them in American terms and in terms of their homelands? In American terms, they were solid, stable, working class. In Jamaica, were they more middle class, or and in Grenada similarly? How would put it in context?
I think that in both of the islands, in Jamaica, let's say this first, my father came from a family where his brother became a leading luminary in the island. I happened to have spent the summer when I was 13 years old, traveling with him throughout the island as he was running for the seventh term as a member of the House of Representatives of Jamaica, which he successfully accomplished. My mother came from Grenada, which is about 1,200 miles away from Jamaica, and they met, of course, in New York City. But while she was in Grenada, she was the daughter of the superintendent of schools for the entire island of Grenada. So she led a very, I would say, upper echelon life in the island, and her exposure was in education. The standards were very high, and her father, being a superintendent, made sure that she had the best of everything, and it was very exceptional.
What took them to America and more specifically Harlem?
Well, that's an interesting question, which I tried to get the answer to myself, and I never really got an answer that was satisfactory to me, because I said in my own mind, why would they leave this very illustrious life in two beautiful islands in the Caribbean and come to Harlem, and go through Ellis Island and all of that. In 1923, my mother, and 1929, my father, when that was the most difficult period economically and in terms of the Black experience for people coming to the island that were Black. So I always wondered, why would you leave to come here? But they did, and fortunately for me, they did. And they met mutual friends, and that's why I'm here.
Well, I'm looking at you, and I read your biography, and I read some archival material, and I read a very famous piece that was published by the New York Times back in the 60s, which was a turning point. We're going to get to that. America has been good to you, but so briefly on Harlem, it was a beautiful place then, idyllic. It's had its share of trouble since. Um, what what was the trajectory of Harlem from your time to today? Because it did have some difficult times socially, at least as we got into the 50s and 60s.
Yes, economically, Harlem has been boom or bust, and that's been its whole historical perspective. In the 1890s, Harlem was the most fashionable part of New York City because people gravitated there when the subways began to operate up to the fringes of Harlem. And of course, there was a boom because the architects and the contractors and the business people all came together and built so many apartment buildings and such that they felt, wow, this is going to be utopia. Well, what happened is in 1904, there were so many buildings that there was a crush, and the financial situation was very disastrous for the entrepreneurs that were building these buildings. So they decided reluctantly that they were going to open these buildings to Blacks. And that's how I got into the picture, because my family moved in early 1930s into this fashionable apartment building that was not built for Blacks. It was built for very elite whites. And we had 7 rooms. It was huge. It was facing St. Nicholas Avenue, which is a large boulevard. And it was just erudite. And we had many, many people there who were professional people at that point. So I had good contacts with people. Then, of course, later on, through the economic depression, there were very bad times for most people living in Harlem. My father, because he was very able to handle a lot of things, he became a superintendent of an artistic building, which was near Lincoln Center. Now, he was there for artists that had their apartments on Park Avenue and so forth, and they had the studios at the building that he was at, Del Mar Studios. When the building was sold, after about 10 years of his being a superintendent, it so happened that they decided they wanted to find a very good job for my father, Eric, because they felt he was just a wonderful person. And they made contacts with the people at Rockefeller Center, and he got a job as the first Black uniformed elevator operator at 30 Rockefeller Center. So he was enamored by this. He loved the job. He never missed a day of work for 30 years. And our life was very exceptional for most people living in Harlem at that point.
One thing characterized your upbringing and had a big impact on your future success was stable family life and the emphasis on education, which presumably came from your mom, but obviously I'm sure from your dad too, because they were hardworking and wanted you to succeed. Your mum was a stickler for education.
Absolutely. She was very, very stringent on that. And it so happened that because I lived in Harlem and it was a districted situation, most of the schools were underperforming in Harlem. So the elementary school that I went to was not exceptional by any means. It was very, very underperforming, and the students did not have the best education by any means. So my mother decided that she would do a little chicanery, and she found that there was someone she knew that lived in the right district, and she would change my address to that district, and I became a student at Joan of Arc Junior High School, which was on 93rd Street and West End Avenue in Manhattan, which was a upper class area. And I had an exceptional middle school or junior high school education. Then I moved on to Music and Art High School, which was like a private school with exceptional students that were gravitating from all over the city. And then from there, of course, I went to NYU and so forth. But these opportunities just came at a very rapid rate, and I was fortunate to get the benefits. But my mother was a stimulus for making sure that my education was exceptional.
Well, in your own words and in the words of other people who know you, you were a brilliant achiever. You succeeded in the academic world, and of course, you were a professor at one point. A major turning point in your life occurred in 1946. You were on a train from New York City to Miami, Florida, eventually en route to Jamaica. And it was an eye-opening experience. Um, Tell us about that.
Well, that was a very sudden experience for me because I was not prepared for it. I lived this idyllic life. I had all the friends that you would have normally, and I went to Central Park on a regular basis because it was 3 blocks away, and I could boat and fish and do all the things that you love to do when you're a youngster. Okay, that summer of 1946, my mother told me in June, when school was ending, that you're not going to be out there playing stickball, because that was my thing, in the summer, this summer. You're going to take a train ride. And I said, wait a minute, where am I going? She said, you're going to Miami. And of course, it didn't have a great deal of meaning to me. So I said, okay, let's see how that works out. And they decided that they would talk to a porter in Penn Station that they happened to know, and they prepared him to be my guidance for the trip down, because of course you're prohibited as a Black person to even be in a compartment. So they took me to Penn Station into this particular compartment, and I was told on the morning that I was leaving that I'm going to be there. The porter is going to take care of all of your facilities. You're going to get your meals delivered. The compartment is going to be locked from the outside. So you're not going to be able to go out or move around or anything. In fact, you need to be very relatively quiet. So that was what I was told. And the train ride took off, and we went to Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and that was pretty typical. But then I got to Washington, D.C., and guess what? After the porter came in, before we got to the station, and closed all of the curtains, and he said, don't mess with my curtains. I said, wait a moment. I'm not accustomed to being told, don't mess with this, don't mess with that, don't mess with my curtains. Well, of course, when he left, I picked it, opened the curtains very carefully, and I saw these signs, and I'd never seen them before. It said, whites only and colored. And these were huge block-lettered white signs. And I said, what's going on here? I couldn't figure it out. I said, maybe it's because, I don't know. But anyhow, people were obeying the signs as we came to each station, all the way down to Miami. And it was a very, very traumatic experience for me because I was in this compartment by myself. So I was literally talking to myself as I saw the kids coming out, maybe 5 years or 6 years old, and they were in shabby clothes and they looked like they were pretty poor kids, black kids, of course, and they would take the packages from the white passengers and they would take them to the door that said whites only, and they would leave them there. The people would throw coins at them, and then they would run back and pick up new passengers, packages, and such. And this went on station after station, all the way down to Miami until I was picked up by my uncle in Miami and taken over to Jamaica, where I spent, I think, 10 weeks or more traveling throughout the island with him. So that was my experience on the train ride.
So this was the era clearly of segregation,
Absolutely.
Institutional discrimination and so on, and it had a traumatic impact on you. Left scars, it sounds like psychological scars.
It had psychological scars. On the way down, and then I get to Jamaica, and it was totally different. Everybody was there. Nobody was talking about segregation or any of that. In fact, when I mentioned it to them, they said, of course, that's what goes on in the United States. And they passed it off like, okay, that's the way it is. But when I came back, as I saw this happening all over again, I was resolute because I was very angry. I was very resolute. And I say, this will never happen to me. I will never be allowing myself to be placed in a position where I'm going to be treated in a manner that was totally demeaning, which is what I experienced as I watched from the window. So that's been very, very emphatic in my whole approach to life, that I was going to be exceptional, I was going to be successful, I was going to be an entrepreneur because I didn't want to work for anybody else. I wanted to do my own thing. And that has taken me in a direction that fortunately has become very, very successful.
So what was the environment like briefly in New York City meanwhile? So we had this segregation down south, New York City. Did you come up against any of that racism,
No,
discrimination?
no, I did not. Personally, yes and no. Let me qualify that. When I grew up as a youngster in pre-teenage years, I had no contacts other than going around with family and friends and people that were very, very convivial. When I took a trip, we had the conveniences of the double-decker bus, which I used a lot. And I would sit on the bus sometimes on a Sunday afternoon and take it all the way down to Washington Square, which is about an hour and a half trip. And then I would come back and I would see people, white, black, so forth and so on, throughout the city. So I got a view from a bus, for example. Now, later on, when I got to junior high school, I realized that, hey, these kids are not very convivial. They are not very anxious to have involvements with a black kid and one that's supposed to be precocious. So I didn't get a lot of friendships there. And then, of course, I went to high school and I was okay. But again, I was in the sharp minority, very few black kids in this prestigious music and art high school where you had to take an exam to get in and so forth. It's a public school, but it was equivalent to a private school in many respects. So I saw a lot of racial attitudes coming across, but okay, I figured, all right, this is the way it is, and I can live with this and so forth. So my experiences were never debilitating in any way. And I therefore felt, okay, there's nothing here that I cannot be exceptional and exceedingly successful with.
An incredible, extraordinarily positive frame of mind you project I must say. Now, you bought your first home in Larchmont in Westchester in 1966. Now, there was a case in point. You came under pressure not to complete your purchase because at least one neighbor objected,
Yes.
and it's
Well,
probably even
it was,
more extreme than that.
it
Tell us
was
in your own words.
it was more extreme. I was a teacher at that point at DeWitt Clinton High School, where I taught for 8 years. After teaching at a 600 school, and I went to the 600 school just because I wanted to get a job after I did a year at NYU Law School, which was following my 4 years at Washington Square College of Arts and Sciences and NYU. So here I am at DeWitt Clinton High School, which is an all-boys school, but average. Results were very successful. The school was very well controlled and everybody was positive, and I had a very good experience as a teacher there. I decided, hey, why don't I find a home in an area that supposedly is a closed community? Okay, all right. And I picked up the newspaper and I saw in Larchmont, which is a mile square community in Westchester, this house that sounded pretty interesting. And I called the broker and I said, I'd like to see this house. And she said, fine, why don't you come up now? Can you get here within the hour? And I said, yes. And I drove up and she took me to the house. And it was on Chatsworth Avenue, 72 Chatsworth Avenue, walking distance to the railroad station, to Grand Central. Everything was exceptional, fireplace and all the rest and so forth. And I immediately said, let's go back to your office and we'll talk about the sale of this house. So we did. And the broker said, the house is $12,500 and you pay a third deposit. And I said, fine. And I wrote a check. I gave it to her and I went home and I told my wife, I said, it looks like we just got ourselves a house in Larchmont. And everybody sounded positive. And the next thing I know, the next day when I was teaching, the principal's office called and said, you have a very important call. So when you get your break, why don't you call back and see what they're calling about? And I did. And this broker that had sold me the house, she said, we've had a lot of problems. I said, what kind of problems are you having? Naively. She said, I kind of suspected I knew what the problem was, but I said, let her explain it. She said, this owner of the house came in. She said, you happen to have left one of the doors open to the broker by mistake. And she said, did you come in here? She said, yes, I came in and I got great news for you. So this owner, who happened to have been out, fortunately for me, at the time that we got there, she said, oh, did you sell the house? She said, yes, I had a buyer. There was no negotiation. He said, I'll accept it at whatever the price is. And he gave me a deposit and everything was fine. And he's got two lovely children. His wife is a big person in New York City, and she's got an executive position. And he is a teacher at a piece at a high school in the Bronx. So she said, that sounds good. What's the story on this family? She said, well, they happen to be a Black family, but they're very, very successful and they're doing very well and all of that. This woman said, wait one moment, please. And she said, no way, Jose, you are not selling my property to a Black family. So she said, well, it so happens that every morning we take our receivables to the bank, which we did. And we took them to the bank this morning and we cashed the check and everything was fine. The woman said, no way, it's not fine. That house is never going to be sold to these folks. So she said she tried to explain Well, once you take a deposit and it's accepted by the broker, that's a transaction and you can't change that just willy-nilly. She said, well, you better figure out how to change it because we're not accepting this. And you tell this person that you think is so illustrious that you are going to find him another apartment in New Rochelle, which is a community just 5 miles away. And he's going to have a better house. You're not going to charge him any commission. In fact, you will even work out some kind of financial deal for his inconvenience. She said, well, I'm not sure that's going to work because the law is very clear on this. But she said, you better find out how it's going to work because that's your responsibility. You need to know that this community is not open and I am not going to break the transaction and the code. So anyway, to make a long story short, the woman was totally insistent. And when she realized that she was not successful with the brokerage firm of Sutton and Whittemore, which is a very established firm in Larchmont, she said, I'm going to call a community meeting and we're going to have a ability to let the public know in Larchmont that this Sutton and Whittemore has done something which we think is reprehensible. They said, well, you can hold a meeting and we can't stop you there, but we can't make anybody do something which is illegal. So she held her meeting and she kind of called me through the broker and said, Mr. Allen is welcome to come to the meeting, which I said, fine. And I went to the meeting and it was packed. All these folks and the neighbors and such were hanging off the staircase upstairs and sitting all over the place. And I was there and they talked for about an hour about how wonderful it is to be welcoming to a community. And this is not going to happen here because of blah, blah, blah. And she went on. And then they said, would you like to say anything, Mr. Allen? And I said, yes. And I said, let me tell you two things. First of all, we have a transaction that is binding and is going to be followed through without exception. And they said, well, what does that mean? They said, it says that this property is going to be sold very, very expeditiously, and we intend to close on this very soon. That's number one. Number two, if you guys insist on continuing this kind of rabble-rousing and so forth, I will have to take some action, and it will not be in the interests of Larchmont because this will become a public record. And I will propel that public record of the fact that you're trying to be illegal in spite of the laws that are very clear on residences and so forth. They were very upset, obviously, with me, and they said the meeting is adjourned, and they left, and that was the end of it. I had no contact with most people in community, with the exception of one family, for 6 years. Until I got a letter that said, we would like to invite you, this family, the Levines, Hal Levine and his wife, we'd like to invite you to a cocktail party that we're having on Saturday night. And I said immediately, yes, I'll be available. And I came there. And to make a long story short, he came over and said to me, what do you do? And I said, well, I happen to be an independent broker dealer with Wall Street and so forth and so on. And he says, tell me about that. And I did. I gave him my elevator pitch, which lasted all of 10 minutes. And then he said, wait a moment. You mean to tell me you have people working that you have trained to become registered representatives and pass the Series 7 exam, which is a very tough exam? I said, yes. How many do you have? I said, at this point, it's over 60. He said, that's unbelievable. He said, why don't you do this? Here's my card. Give me a call on Monday. I'd like to set up a meeting with you to come to my office at the Pan Am building on Wednesday of this week at lunchtime. Can you make it? I said, yes, I'll be there. And that's how the newspaper article with the New York Times came about, because the person I was meeting was Robert Hershey, who was a financial correspondent for the New York Times and read my story did some checking, of course, and after a 3-hour meeting, decided that I would go to the New York Times for a photograph, and the next part was history. I was in the newspaper the next morning.
So you opened that broker dealer a few years prior to you buying the house in Larchmont. You called the brokerage Creative Investor Services.
Yes, I did.
Meanwhile, you were still had other jobs going on. You had your academic career. I mean, the amount of energy this must have taken to me is just mind-boggling.
Well,
So you were
yes,
the first black-owned broker-dealer.
yes,
Then the New York Times decide to do a very positive story about your firm, which got picked up and I guess in effect syndicated,
that,
and your company grew from there.
that's right. It went up geometrically. And we had been doing a lot of seminars on wealth building in the Black community and so forth. We had maybe at that point 70 registered reps that were selling various types of securities, mostly mutual funds and so forth. But the New York Times picked up the story. They called it Crash Course Creates Salesman. And it was very dramatic. And it created a number of interesting things because other firms that had disregarded the possibilities of any income coming out of the Black community said, wait a moment, this guy is doing this. He's got people out there selling and they're buying his securities. Why don't we check it out? And then all of a sudden, you began to see more and more interest in advertising to the Black community. And so that was one element. Of course, it mushroomed in the sense that more and more people said, wait a moment, let's take our discretionary funds and put them into some type of capital building process. And that's where we came in. So it was a marvelous experience. And it mushroomed our company. And then C. Peter McCullough, who was the chairman of the board of the Xerox Corporation, came to me and asked me if I would be interested in coming to a meeting at Xerox to talk about possibly joining the company. And I turned him down 3 times because I said, no, I'm working on my doctorate, which is being completed at Fordham University. I'm also running a company of broker dealers. I mean, not broker dealers, I'm saying, but of registered representatives. And I am also a teacher at DeWitt Clinton High School. I'm sorry, Fordham University. So those things were coming together. And I said, it's not possible for me to get involved in a corporation at this point. But they said, look, forget about Fordham. We're going to offer you something that you're not going to be able to turn down. We'll triple whatever you're earning from all of these ventures. And we want you to come aboard and run our entire corporate-wide training program for sales, service, and management. And that was phenomenal opportunity. I said, wait a moment, I've got to look seriously into this. And many, many people told me, oh no, don't even get involved. You got such a deluxe situation. Why would you go to a corporation where, you know, it's cutthroat and it's difficult and you don't know who's friend or foe in these corporations? And I listened to all of this, and then I called and I told Xerox, yes, I will accept your offer. And I went there thinking it will last a couple of years, and then I'll go back to Fordham, because Fordham said, don't worry, your job is going to be held for you. And guess what? It turned out to 10 years that I was an executive at Xerox, traveling in rank Xerox throughout Europe and also within the United States, including Palo Alto Research Center, which was Xerox's unbelievable opportunity for the best scientists in the whole field of computer technology. So that was my experience, and I was there from 1971 to 1981.
So tell us a little bit more about this Xerox experience. To me, that's really fascinating. You were teaching them sales and best practices.
Yes, yes,
Um, what
we-
what
yeah.
did you impart on them that couldn't be found elsewhere, and that Xerox was so hungry for?
That was very interesting. Xerox, first of all, said to me, I'd like you to go down to our training facility in Florida. And I said, okay. And I did go for a week. They had this thing right at the beach. They had a hotel, the Sheraton Hotel. And I was shocked because the training that they were giving to salesmen, just for example, was very primitive. It was not using any of the new technologies, none of the interactive methodology. Students were sitting in a theater style and so forth. So when I came back after a week, and all these executives were sitting around a conference table asking me, "Okay, what did you think of our training program?" I wanted to say to them, "Look, this training program sucks." But I said, let's be diplomatic. So I said there's certain deficiencies, and I'd like to spell them out. And I could see they were writing on their yellow pads all the things I was saying, how we would do this and how we should do that. And the fact that the classroom should not be in a structured way. There should be circular training, should be open for people to interact. The instructor should be sitting in the group circle, and he should be talking. This all should be on tape so that the students could go back and reference what he had said to them and so forth. I had so many suggestions, and I thought, okay, that takes care of that. Xerox is going to say goodbye, and I'll go back to my routine. And they said to me, before you leave, we have a proposition. The chairman has told us that we should make you an offer. I said, an offer? They said, yes, we would like to make you an offer, and that will be that you will be in charge of the entire training facility in Leesburg, Virginia. We're building this $80 million live-in and learning facility, which we call the Xerox University, and you're going to be in charge. I said, this is phenomenal. And I have to think about it. They said, well, we'll give you 3 days, and then you get back to us and you tell us what you think you would like to do. And I called them back, and of course I told them yes. And that's how my career at Xerox came about. It was very phenomenal because after 3 years in Leesburg, Virginia, and that was a whole story in itself, because I told them, I said, I'm not prepared to live in Virginia. I'd like to live in Bethesda, Maryland. And I thought, okay, that would be the end of that. No, they said, no, that's fine. You want to live in Maryland, you find yourself a house, which I did. And they said to the person who is going to be in charge of the hotel facility, Bill Detting, you are now going to drive from McLean, Virginia, and pick this Winston Allen up and bring him to Leesburg on a daily basis, and then return him home and so forth. I didn't know that all this machinery was taking place, but I saw Bill coming at 7:30 and driving me in his white Cadillac down there to McLean, past McLean. And you know, the Beltway in Washington is very difficult in rush hour. And it was an hour and a half trip. And he would do that every day for 3 years. And I said, wow, this is quite an experience. And it wasn't until one day, my wife, Ruby, and I went to one of their social events. And I said, Ruby, now be cool, because Ruby was a shoot from a hip kind of person. And she was very cool. And she told Bill Detting how much I loved the Xerox and all that. But then she said, can I speak to his wife? And I said, okay, Ruby, go ahead. And she went over there. And all I can remember, across the room in this social event, this woman saying, poor Win, poor Bill. And I said, oh, well, you can't imagine what I said, but I realized that Ruby had exploded this whole thing. And guess what? The wife had told Bill, this is it. You're not going to get up at 5:30 every morning and drive all the way up to Bethesda to pick the twin Allen up and drive him down and bring him back in the evening. I said, and that's when it was a very catastrophic period, because it came to the attention of Peter McCullough. And Peter said, who's the chairman of the board? He said, wait a moment, no way are you going to get rid of this guy, because this was the plan. I would be terminated and I would get 6 months and all that and severance pay. And he said, no, Win is going over to Dusseldorf, Germany in 2 weeks. And he is going to be in charge of the rank Xerox training program. And that includes London and Amsterdam and Dusseldorf and so forth. And I didn't know how I was going to make this transition. He said, you got 2 weeks to find a house close enough to Stanford, where the corporate headquarters is located. And I was lucky because I found a house which is ideal in Westport, Connecticut. And so that's where I've been living for 48 years.
Yeah, and it's a landmarked house, we should add, right? It's quite a unique building and structure.
It was so marvelous because it comes out of the Mies van der Rohe School of Modern Architecture. And the fact that I lucked into a broker who said, when she heard I was going to be executive at Xerox, said, send him in here. And I came into her office and she said, wow, I've been trying to get my relocation business going in Xerox for 5 years. And every time I think I have it sold up, somebody on the inside cuts me out. And guess what? Now I could have a friend in Xerox in high places. So I said, oh, okay. She said, what kind of house are you looking for? Well, I gave her my wish list. It's got to be near the water. It should be ultra-modern. It should be a famous architect and so forth. She said, let's get in the house, get in the car. My wife and I, we drove over. We saw this house in 15 minutes. I said, Ruby, this is it. She said, I know, this is your dream house. And I said, but we're going to leave. And then the next day I sent her a check for a third of the price. The house was selling for $142,000. And I sent her the deposit because I knew I had to move very quickly. And she called me back in 3 hours after it was wired to her. And she said, you are now the owner of this Burris Landing property. And that was the beginning of a whole story, which is also very interesting.
And you've lived there since, and you love your home. So back to the reassignment to the German market. So did that mean you flew into Germany every so often and had extended periods in Germany?
Exactly. I flew into Germany. Dusseldorf was the headquarters at that time for Rank Xerox in Europe. And London, of course, was also headquarters. So I was flying between the United States and these various capitals and meeting with the executives in their training facilities. And while I was not telling them what to do, my job was to influence them to move in a direction that Peter McCullough felt was very productive for us. Their numbers were not as great as our numbers in terms of productivity and the reduction of the cost. And so he said, this is the way we want to go. And most of them did. And it was very successful.
I wanted to ask you about sales, because you were in sales and you taught these dynamic salespeople and highly motivated and were very big into their careers. What in your view is the essence of sales? Can anybody sell, or can you be taught to be a good salesperson?
It's a good question, very good question, because over the years, I have found that anybody cannot sell. Okay, it doesn't happen that way. You have to have that germ that says you are a motivator. You are a very intricate person that understands the dynamics of human beings, and you can talk to them in a language that they understand. And if you have all those qualities and you're persevering and you're confident and you are able to communicate very quickly the facts that will be beneficial to their needs, you will be a very successful salesperson. And that's the kind of persons that I always attracted myself to, because I knew they had the potential to be successful. If you don't have that, if you're not a risk taker, if you don't have super confidence, you probably are not going to be a successful salesperson.
I had a great friend in sales once. He was a top manager, and I learned a few things listening to him. I wasn't in sales, but the thing that struck me was he said it's closing the deal.
Yes.
That he mentioned that closing the deal, and I was often wondering what was he talking about. But I took it to mean that you could wine and dine a client, take them out, and they love you, and you're hugging and kissing. But if you can't put the paper on the table and say, "Hey, sign the dotted line here and give me the deposit check," you can't say it, right? You can't do it.
That is so important. For example, just one little statement that I used to use in training salespeople. I would say, let's say you made your proposition, you kept it simple, you got to their needs, not your needs, their needs, and you explain how this problem was going to be resolved by using whatever the formula was. And then when you make your pitch, stop talking. Shut up. That's it. Silence. Because the first person that talks after that loses. And they learned that technique. It made all the difference. Because so many times, salesmen, after they have done their sales pitch, they keep talking and they talk themselves out of a sale. And I'm saying that I found that if they understand that you don't control the person thinking, let them think the process through and then come back to you, you have a good chance of completing a transaction successfully.
So Creative Investor Services, did you eventually sell that company, or do you still have a passive interest in it?
No, I did sell it. It was sold to a firm in Florida, and it was very successful sale, but I had the firm from 1962 when the company started. And it was interesting. I didn't want my name to be on the company, the Allen Security Company, like Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers or JP Morgan. I said, let's find this thing that works for people. Creative, because it's different. Investor, because that's what we're going to be doing. And services, because that's what the company is going to do. We're going to provide services, not just selling and moving on, but staying with the customers. And we have stayed with them for 30, 40 years. And some of them have taken their sales and they have made their profitable situation, paid for their education for their kids, and gone to the places that they wanted and so forth. But my point was always make sure that you are able to deliver on whatever you promise. And that's the essence of successful selling. So the Creative Investor Services continued until it was sold about 2.5 years ago. And I have no contact with it anymore, although I still am a broker dealer, because you keep that for a period of 2 years and you can then attach yourself to another company. And I'm open for that possibility because my 2 years is still not finished.
You've written about your experiences, your early life, your college, being a professor, setting up your own firm, working at the Xerox Corporation. In your new book, I pried open Wall Street in 1962. That's the headline on it. Overcoming barriers, hurdles, and obstacles. And it's a personal memoir. Winston E. Allen, PhD. Let's go back to the beginning and your train journey and segregation in America and how you saw it then and how you see it now. I mean, the civil rights movement was a campaign in the 1950s and 1960s for Black Americans to gain, rightfully so, equal rights under the law in the United States. It was We went through the Rosa Parks era, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. We went through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Then we had the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So, for all intents and purposes, institutional racism has been eradicated in America, which is not to say that there's not a residue of maybe cultural racism, what people keep in their hearts, but it's a much better place, I would hope. And yet we see the country is so divided, and we see a lot of polarization and a lot of strife. How do you actually see it today?
Well, it's very interesting that we have a a cyclical situation in the United States. It doesn't move geometrically. It doesn't move steadily, and you don't understand everything that's going on. But there are many, many residues that remain, and the history, of course, of the United States is very convoluted, and it has a lot of issues that people need to know more about. But to just get to the bottom line, the opportunities are there. And I always believe that for every difficulty, if you are really perceptive, you will find the opportunity that will make a difference. And that's what I have always pursued as my ultimate objective. Yes, difficulties I had in my lifetime, and I had many opportunities that were extraordinary. So I think there's a balancing there. I think that it's not to be downplayed, the fact that there is optimism if a person equips themselves to take advantage of whatever opportunities come along whenever they do come along. And that's the ultimate, because everybody has difficulties. And I don't believe that difficulties can create such impossible conditions that you cannot survive and prosper if you are willing to put in the heavy labor and legwork and perseverance and tenacity that is required. And that's what I think is the answer ultimately. There's no question that it's going to be successful, because over the years, the situation was so impossible. And we don't have to go into the whole slavery period, but we know that that was all but impossible. And yet there was survival. And therefore, there is an opportunity to take any condition and make sure that there is going to be a prosperous way to function, even in the most debilitating circumstances.
So what you're telling me, that, people of all classes, races, and creeds, for the most part in America, have a great opportunity to succeed if they will take the time, effort, get an education or a vocation, and they can succeed. You are a classic example of it.
Well, I believe this is definitely true, and I believe, and that's one of the reasons why I've taken the time to write 3 books, because I feel that this gives inspiration and motivation to people who might feel, oh, it's not worth it. I don't want to do all of this because I don't see the end result. I have had so many people that have told me, just reading the books and seeing the difficulties that I overcame has changed their life, and they pass it on to their children and their grandchildren to read this book and get the motivation that they need to conquer the problems that they're facing. So I have no doubt that it's doable. And I will mentor many people along the lines of finding a way to accomplish whatever needed to be accomplished. I have gotten people to go to the universities who said, no, I don't have the money. And I got scholarships. One person went to Japan and got a $68,000 scholarship from Rotary and became a master's in public administration, and is now being profitably rewarded, and so forth. So things can happen, but it's got to take planning and a willingness to work at it until you accomplish your goal.
Well, if you were to sum it up and to maybe comment, things have greatly improved for the Black community and for, in air quotes, for minority communities. I've spoken to other commentators, social workers, and political leaders, and they've said to me, they've brought this up, and your insight would be really interesting. That part of the problem, or let's call it the legacy, if you will, for the Black community that maybe hasn't caught up and has fallen behind, is to do with the collapse of the Black family in America, going back to the opening up of the Great Society in the 1960s, the welfare state, and that's a whole other separate discussion. And indeed, we may be seeing that happening in the white community now. There's, in other words, the rise of single parenthood, the rise of families that just don't have any stability in their life, and just their communities are just broken down.
Yes. At the bottom of so much of this is the economics. Economics is the key. In a capitalistic society, if the economics is not there in your family, or if there's a breakdown in the family, it's going to come back to the fact that you are not going to be able to be successful if you cannot compete economically in the society. In spite of all of the difficulties, and we know that they're there and so forth, and they're well reported. My problem with the whole concept of, well, it's defeatism, because we don't want to be, categorized as a group that's not successful, and therefore we are the cause of the problem. The problem has roots that go way, way back. And the fact that education was denied when a person was in subterfuge and all the rest of that. But the fact of the matter is, again, given the opportunities that are now there is a way of meeting these. And it's not only in the Black community, it's also in the white community. Because if the economics is not there, it means that there will not be the progression that would be normally expected of a group that has had more opportunities than people of color. So I think that we can use the commonality, find a way to see what is the best solution to an individual problem. Now, broken families, of course, create a number of problems, not only for the couple, but for the offspring. So we know that that has ramifications. So all those things of how to create a climate where there can be more compatibility and so forth is helpful. I found in my experience that I took a very difficult position, because I said I will not limit myself to living only in segregated communities. I would not do that. And therefore, I chose to go into communities that were extremely repressive, and they had closed communities. Now, that's taking on a big risk and a big challenge. And if you are willing to put up with it, it has ramifications. If I had not gone to Larchmont, I would not have been able to meet the opportunity for Hal Levine, who was the president of a public relations firm, to give me what was $1 million worth of publicity and promotion at a critical time, 1968, July 31st. That was the most difficult period in the civil rights movement. We had gone through the sit-ins and the freedom rides and the whole repressive period and the bombing in Alabama. We had gone through the Rosa Parks story and the Emmett Till story. So if you found a 1 year that culminated all of this, 68 was the year. Martin Luther King's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, the whole Democratic Party's problems, police department and all the rest in Chicago, the 1.5 million kids on the street in New York City for a teacher strike, which was promulgated by the whole issue of community control of education, because what was taking place up to that point was perceived not to be productive. All of that came together in 1968. So I'm saying, yes, there is a history here that is enormously important to understand. But even with all of that, we found a way to move the ball a little bit further. And yes, this is a divided community, but it's the boom and bust again. The cyclical problems will resolve themselves and we will move forward again. I do believe.
And I think I hear you saying also a busy, active life dedicated to work, education, sports, family. You have no time to go off on the wrong tracks, unless, of course, there's some kind of a weird disruption all around us, which a lot of us have no control over in the end. But you have set a great example. You've also written, the author of Don't Get Mad, Get Rich. You're also the author of Live a Purposeful and Meaningful Life. The name of your new book is I Pried Open Wall Street in 1962, Overcoming Barriers, Hurdles, and Obstacles. My final question, you're doing multiple projects at any one time. You're a really busy and engaged entrepreneur, businessman, and now a successful author. Your legacy, how would you like to be remembered by the world, by society, by your peers, by your family?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's an excellent question as a culmination, because I think legacy is so important, because you have to know that in future generations, people can learn about what you did and be inspired by it. I read history books all the time, biographies, and I'm inspired by the stories that I read. So my legacy, I hope, shows take on difficult tasks, dedicate yourself to them, work unbelievably difficult circumstances. When people say, no, it cannot be done, don't take that as an absolute. Say, yes, it can be done. I will find a way. If this is what I choose to do, I am going to be successful. That's the way I feel. And if I can leave that as my legacy, I think it will be a worthwhile story that could be told. And I'm told that this story of my book, I Pried Open Wall Street in 1962, critical years, is the makings of a film that could be very, very helpful and monumental. And that's my goal now, to move in the direction of someone who's out there who is willing to make a commitment to make lots of money for themselves by taking this story that's sitting there in book form with all the documentation, with all the pictures, with all of the evidence to show that every story is able to be proven to be factual, and turn that into a prize-winning film. That's the ultimate objective, which I have. And if I'm successful in that respect, then I think, wow, this would be a very interesting legacy.
Well, I look forward to that movie coming out, and I'll see you walking the red carpet.
Well,
Dr. Winston Allen, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this great opportunity.